That bastard child still thinks she's one of us. The words sliced through the wedding tent like a blade through silk. Glasses froze midair. Conversations died. Even the ocean breeze seemed to pause, as if the world itself held its breath. My father's voice, steady, cold, deliberate, echoed across white tablecloths and stunned faces. Every guest heard it. No one moved. I didn't drop my champagne. I didn't flinch. I simply turned my head toward him, meeting his gaze with the stillness he'd once demanded of me. What happened next would become the moment that defined everything we'd never been to each other. But that moment was built on 30 years of silence. And silence, I've learned, can be the heaviest armor you'll ever wear. Colonel Warren Hayes, retired. 3 tours, Bronze Star recipient. The man who taught me that silence was strength sat tall in his civilian suit, campaign ribbons pinned proudly across his chest. He looked at me with the same cold scrutiny he'd used on subordinates who'd failed inspection. His lips didn't tremble. Mine almost did. The air in that tent thickened until it felt hard to breathe. My husband-to-be Grant froze mid-laugh, his hand still raised from gesturing to a friend. The band stopped tuning their instruments. Someone coughed a nervous, uncomfortable sound that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet. The smell of roasted beef and roses turned sour in the tension, mixing with the salt air that had felt so perfect just moments before. Then, from the far end of the room, a chair scraped against the wooden floor. The sound was deliberate, unmistakable. The best man a Marine I'd once commanded during a deployment that nearly broke us both rose to his feet. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and brought his hand to his brow in a salute so crisp, so deliberate, you could hear the fabric of his sleeve brush against his temple. The gesture hung in the air like a challenge. Then another stood. And another. Within seconds, the room filled with the sound of uniforms shifting, chairs sliding back, heels snapping together in perfect formation. Dozens of men and women, people who'd seen me at my worst, who'd trusted me with their lives, who knew exactly what I'd earned, stood at attention. Their salutes formed a wall of respect that my father couldn't ignore, couldn't diminish, couldn't tear down with his words. My father's face went pale. He didn't stand. He didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead, jaw locked, as if the entire scene were an act of insubordination against his private kingdom. A rebellion he'd never trained for and couldn't command to stop. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The salute said what words couldn't. It said you belong here. It said we see you. It said his opinion never mattered as much as you thought it did. When the last salute lowered, I turned back toward the altar where Grant waited, his eyes searching mine for permission to speak, to defend, to act. I gave him a small nod that meant I'm okay. My voice came out even, steady. The voice I'd used in control towers when lives hung in the balance. Let's finish this, I said. And we did. Later, when the guests had left, and the lights dimmed to nothing but moonlight through the windows, I sat alone in the bridal suite. I was still in my uniform, the white dress coat that had caused him to sneer, the medals that gleamed like tiny ghosts of battles he'd never asked about. The phone buzzed against the vanity. A text from him. No greeting, no signature, just 9 words that felt like a final order. You've embarrassed this family enough. Don't call me again. I locked the screen, set it face down, and took a deep breath. It didn't hurt as much as I expected. Maybe because somewhere deep inside I already knew. He'd stopped being my father long before that night. The title had been empty for years, a uniform with no one wearing it. But he hadn't always been this way. There was a time distant now, almost dreamlike, when he'd been my first salute, my first authority, my first wall to climb. Growing up in Roanoke, Virginia, as the daughter of a veteran was supposed to be a badge of honor, until you were the daughter born outside of marriage. Until you were the secret that everyone knew, the mistake whispered about in grocery store aisles and church pews. My mother, Claire, was a nurse at the VA hospital. She met him between deployments, when he was still wearing the jungle on his shoulders, the smell of rain and gun oil, the weight of things he couldn't speak about. She used to say he looked like he'd been carved out of duty itself, all sharp edges and unshakable will. To me, he was a myth come home in human form, larger than life and twice as distant. He never lived with us. He visited twice a month, sometimes less, depending on where the military sent him or where his other life called him back to. When I asked why he didn't stay, Mom would smooth my hair and say softly, "Your father serves in different ways. I didn't understand until years later that sometimes serving meant escaping. Sometimes duty was just another word for avoidance. He taught me things, though. How to lace boots so tight your feet couldn't shift even a fraction. How to shoot straight, breathing out slowly before the trigger pull. How to speak only when you were certain, never filling silence with uncertainty. But he never said the word daughter. I was kid or you. Never sweetheart. Never mine. At school, other kids whispered that I was the colonel's mistake. In a small town like Roanoke, gossip doesn't just stick, it becomes part of the architecture. It gets built into who you are before you even understand what it means. Mom told me to ignore them, to keep my head high no matter what they said. The world will find reasons to shame you, she said, folding laundry with hands that never stopped moving. Don't help it do the job. When I turned 18, I enlisted. Not to rebel, I'd never been the rebellious type. I enlisted to prove I was more than a footnote in someone else's story. I chose the Air Force because he'd served in the Army. I wanted my own sky, my own branch, my own path that didn't run parallel to his. When I told him, he looked at me for a long time. It was one of those looks that measured you from the inside out, cataloguing your weaknesses, noting where you'd break under pressure. Then he said, his voice flat and final, "You think wearing a uniform makes you one of us?" It doesn't. I still remember that moment clearer than any deployment briefing. The way he polished his wedding ring from his second marriage to a woman I barely knew while telling me I'd never belong. I said nothing. I'd learned that from him, too. I straightened my shoulders and saluted. He didn't return it. He just turned back to whatever he'd been reading, dismissing me like a subordinate who'd wasted his time. Years later, after my first overseas tour, I mailed him a photograph. Me, covered in desert dust, holding a folded flag over a downed helicopter we'd managed to secure. My team had worked 18 hours straight to bring everyone home. I thought maybe this would be the proof he needed. Maybe this would make him see me differently. He sent it back. Folded neatly, no creases, no damage. No note. Just the faint smell of his aftershave on the envelope, Old Spice mixed with something sharper. Something that smelled like disappointment. So when I walked down that aisle in dress whites, it wasn't rebellion. It was truth. I wasn't making a statement. I was wearing my life, the one I'd built without his approval. The one that had meaning even when he refused to see it. The wedding wasn't fancy. Just a chapel by the sea, white chairs arranged on sand, a brass quartet playing softly as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. I didn't invite half the people I'd served with. The list would have been too long. The logistics too complicated. But they came anyway. Marines, pilots, medics, support staff. They filled the pews like silent sentinels, their presence a kind of armor I hadn't known I needed. He came too. Of course he did. Front row, starched collar, eyes sharp and assessing. He didn't smile during the ceremony. He barely looked at me. But when the officiant said those traditional words, "Who gives this woman?" he interrupted before anyone else could speak. "She gives herself." His voice was cold, clipped. Always does. Laughter died mid-breath. Grant froze beside me, his hand tightening on mine. The officiant fumbled for the next line, unsure whether to continue or address what had just happened. I squeezed Grant's hand twice our signal for "I'm okay. Keep going," and we moved forward. And then came the reception. The toast. The slur that would echo far beyond that tent. That night, reporters would call it the salute heard around the corps. They'd ask for interviews, for statements, for the story behind the photo that would go viral within hours. I never answered their questions. To me, it wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about making a point or winning some battle in the court of public opinion. It was about something far simpler and far more profound. It was about finally understanding that family isn't defined by the people who share your blood. It's the ones who rise for you when the world sits still. It's the ones who stand when standing costs them something. I looked at my dress uniform draped over the chair beside me, the ribbons catching moonlight through the window. Every medal told a story he'd never asked to hear. Every stripe represented a conversation we'd never had, a moment of pride he'd never shared, an accomplishment that had mattered to everyone except him. I thought about calling him. My finger hovered over his contact still listed as Colonel Hayes in my phone. Never Dad, never anything softer. But I didn't call. Instead, I whispered to the empty room, my voice barely audible even to myself. "You raised a soldier, Dad. You just never learned how to salute her." And for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of war. Morning light in Roanoke has a particular quality to it, the kind that makes even old, weathered porches look freshly painted, even when the boards are splintered and soft beneath your feet. I grew up under that light, on a street where American flags hung year-round and every other mailbox had a last name that matched a headstone out at the Veterans Cemetery. Small-town Virginia teaches you two lessons fast. First, everybody knows your business. Second, what they don't know, they'll guess. And their guesses will be worse than the truth. My mother, Claire, tried to keep our small house quiet and warm, a refuge from the gossip that swirled around us like persistent fog. She worked the night shift at the VA hospital, bringing her tenderness home in the early morning hours. She was the kind of woman who could take a man's blood pressure and calm his nightmares in the same breath, who understood that healing happened in the spaces between medicine and mercy. When I was little, she smelled like ivory soap and strong coffee. She kept a jar of mismatched buttons by her sewing machine and a bowl of Hershey's Kisses by the front door. The buttons never ran out. She collected them from old clothes, from thrift stores, from anywhere, but the candy always did. There was never enough sweetness to go around. The Colonel didn't live with us. He existed more like a weather pattern, blowing in on certain Saturdays with his pressed shirts and polished shoes, leaving the scent of shoe polish and authority behind when he left. He never arrived without warning. He issued it like an order, precise and non-negotiable. 1400 hours. Be ready. Mom would iron my best dress, the one with the small flowers she'd sewn on to hide a stain, and comb my hair until the part was surgical, perfectly straight. When his knock came 3 sharp raps, never gentle, I'd stand at attention, chin up like she'd taught me, hands at my sides. He'd look me over the way he must have inspected formations, his eyes measuring everything, meeting nothing. Well, he'd say, already turning toward his car. Let's go! On those drives, he'd point out landmarks with the same tone he might have used to identify tactical positions. Monuments, armories, athletic fields where young men prepared their bodies for service. Discipline built this country, he'd say, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with his words. Not sentiment, not softness. If I dared ask about the jungle photograph tucked in his wallet, him and 2 other young men, shirts off, rifles slung casually, grinning like they'd beaten death for a day, he'd snap the wallet shut with a decisive click. That's past. Keep your eyes forward. Mom told me once that he'd served 3 tours and come home with a limp he'd trained out of his walk and a silence he never did. She also told me, her voice careful and sad, that he had a wife by then in another town. Another life and a son on the way. He's doing his best, she said, as if that explained everything. And I nodded like it was an answer, even though it never felt like one. The first time a kid at school called me a bastard, I went home and looked the word up in the dictionary. The definition was neat and clinical, all the ugliness drained out of it. A person born of parents not married to each other. It seemed too clean for the way the word had been used, too bloodless for the shame it was supposed to carry. I preferred the dictionary to the whispers, the cold facts to the hot judgment. Church taught forgiveness, gym class taught dodgeball. The cafeteria taught hierarchy, who sat where, who spoke to whom, where I fit in the carefully constructed social order. I learned quickly that there are 3 kinds of looks people give you when they think they know your story. Pity, which is lazy and assumes you need saving. Judgment, which is noisy and wants everyone to know it's better than you. And interest, which is dangerous because it always wants more details, more pain, more proof that you're exactly what they suspected. I kept my head down, my grades up, and my hands busy. I mowed lawns in the summer, stacked shelves at the hardware store after school, saved every dollar for a future that didn't require anyone to introduce me or explain where I came from. At 11, I could field strip Mom's ancient toaster and reassemble it faster than most people could describe what was wrong with it. I could also recite the Colonel's lectures on posture and discipline by heart, even when he wasn't there. He bought me my first pair of real boots when I was 12, a size too big, so I could grow into accountability, as he put it. He taught me to lace them tight, heel-locked, tongue-centered, each action precise and purposeful. A boot is a promise, he said, watching my hands work the laces. It keeps your foot where it belongs. When I asked what kept a family where it belonged, he adjusted the final knot without looking at me and said simply, "Stand straight." There were kindnesses, though. Small ones, accidental ones, the kind that made me think maybe there was something underneath all that rigid control. Once, when Mum worked a double shift and the neighbour's aggressive dog cornered me on our back steps, he stepped between us without a word. He didn't shout or make sudden moves. He just stared the animal down with that same cold authority and pointed one finger toward its yard. The dog went home. He didn't comfort me afterward, didn't ask if I was okay. He just inspected the gate latch, fixed the loose hinge with tools from his trunk, and left without saying goodbye. The hinge held for years after that. The fear stayed inside me a while longer. Middle school slid into high school the way summer slides into fall, slowly at first, then all at once. I found ROTC and ROTC found me. The uniform fit like the answer to a question I'd been asking my whole life. Finally, I had a structure that made sense, rules that applied to everyone equally. A way to prove myself that had nothing to do with who my parents were or weren't. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. By the book. Not because I feared punishment, though that was always there, but because the book felt cleaner than rumour, more solid than gossip. I learned to march until my thoughts fell into cadence, until the rhythm of my boots on pavement drowned out the whispers I'd grown up hearing. I learned that respect is built from 1,000 small acts done right, especially when no one's grading you, when no one's watching. On awards night my junior year, I stood in a borrowed blazer too big in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves while they called names for scholarships I couldn't reach. The colonel didn't come. Mom did, though. She sat in the back row and clapped like every certificate I received was a victory parade, like every small achievement was proof that we'd done something right. Afterward, my ROTC instructor, Chief Price, a Navy veteran who'd traded saltwater for chalk dust, pressed a pamphlet into my hand. His grip was firm, his eyes serious. "You're the kind they want," he said quietly. "Academy material, if you can stomach the politics." The pamphlet had a ship on the front, a gleaming campus on the back, and a promise folded between the pages: make your life count twice. Once for yourself, once for your country. I took the sati with a fever and an iron will. I ran bleachers at sunrise until my legs shook. I learned to deadlift my own doubts, to push through the voice that said I wasn't good enough, wasn't legitimate enough, wasn't really one of them. I visited the colonel to tell him I would apply to the academy. He was cleaning his glasses when I arrived, holding them up to the light to check for smudges. He kept cleaning while I spoke, as if my words were background noise he could tune out whenever he chose. "That place eats the weak," he said when I finished. His tone was flat, matter of fact. "I'm not weak," I said. "You're naive." He put his glasses back on and looked at me with something that might have been concern if it had been warmer. "Still, if you go to learn, not to be seen." He didn't write a recommendation letter. Chief Price did. So did my chemistry teacher, Mrs. Chen, who had a soft spot for quiet girls with exact answers and determined eyes. Mum wrote me notes on torn pieces of paper that she tucked into my lunch bag. Proud of the miles you're putting between their thoughts and your truth. When the thick envelope came in April, the kind that means yes, the kind that changes everything, I took it out to the back steps and opened it sitting on the hinge he'd fixed years before. "Appointment tendered," it said in formal official language. I ran my fingers over the raised seal like it might burn me if I pressed too hard. It didn't burn. It steadied me, gave me something solid to hold on to. We celebrated with takeout lumen and paper plates at our kitchen table. Mom cried once, then pretended she hadn't by busying herself with rearranging the soy sauce packets. I called the colonel. He didn't answer. I let it ring until voicemail picked up, then hung up without leaving a message. I drove to his house, red brick, American flag out front. Another woman's voice calling from somewhere inside. He met me on the porch, the door half closed behind him like he was blocking a draft, or blocking me from seeing too much of the life he'd built without us. I held up the letter, the envelope still crisp in my hands. I got in. "Good," he said. His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to my face, his jaw set. "Don't embarrass the uniform." I should have been crushed. Part of me expected to be. But instead I felt something harden inside me, not anger exactly, but structure. Steel forming where softer things used to be. Steel doesn't apologize to rust. Steel doesn't beg for recognition. I saluted him. Clean, proper, by the book. He didn't return it. He just turned and walked back inside, closing the door with a soft click that felt louder than any slammed door could have. The summer before I left Roanoke, the air turned humid and forgiving in that way Virginia summers do. I spent my mornings running the Greenway Trail that wound along the river and my nights at the VA, filling in for Mom when her feet gave out and her back couldn't take another shift. The old veterans taught me things no textbook ever would, things about survival and loss, about carrying weight you couldn't see. One showed me how to fold a flag so tight the corners could cut, each movement precise and reverent. Another told me the 3 most dangerous phrases in any war zone: just this once. It'll be fine. Nobody's watching. I tucked those warnings away like field dressings, knowing I'd need them someday. The week I shipped out for basic training, the colonel called at 6 in the morning. His voice was flat, emotionless, with a clock ticking in the background like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. "Pick you up?" he asked, as if he were offering a ride to the grocery store instead of to the beginning of everything I'd worked for. "Mom's got it covered," I said. "Suit yourself." Then, softer, almost human, almost something that resembled care: "Eat before you go. First day will strip you bare." At the airport, Mom hugged me hard enough to reset my spine. Her arms wrapped around me like she could hold me there if she just squeezed tight enough. "They'll try to make you smaller to fit their mold," she whispered into my collar, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "Don't shrink. Get bigger. Get truer." I promised I would. The TSA agent waved me forward, and I stepped through security into a life measured in inspections and formations. Drill commands and early sunrises, friendships forged at the temperature of fire. The academy didn't love me. It respected me 3 semesters late, but it happened. The first months were a study in efficient humiliation, designed to break you down and rebuild you into something harder, something that could withstand pressure without cracking. Shouted names at 5 in the morning, sleep rationed like precious medicine. Every mistake catalogued, every weakness exposed. I learned to square corners on a bed tight enough to bounce a coin on. I learned to absorb criticism without chewing on it, to let it hit me and pass through without leaving permanent damage. I learned to run on legs that voted against motion every single morning. I learned the names and specifications of aircraft the way other girls my age learned the names of perfumes and pop stars. I also learned where silence ends and voice begins, where staying quiet becomes complicity and speaking up becomes duty. The day a training officer called a classmate China doll in front of the entire formation, I filed a formal report. It didn't make me popular. Popularity is a sugar high, sweet and fleeting, and ultimately empty. Integrity is protein. It sustains you. I fed myself accordingly. When the letter came announcing my service selection, aviation command and control, my stomach dropped and settled like a plane descending through turbulence. "This is your chair," the paper seemed to say. "Own it." I called Mom first. She screamed with joy so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. I called the colonel next. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. I told him my assignment. For the first time in years, his voice lifted half a degree, not warm, but warmer. "That will do," he said. Then, because he couldn't help himself, "Don't miss." I didn't. I graduated without fanfare, without family photos on the quad that other cadets posed for with proud parents and tearful siblings. Mom stood at the back of the ceremony, clapping with her whole face, her smile so wide it seemed to take up all the space her small frame could offer. The colonel stayed away. No call, no card, no acknowledgement that this day meant anything at all. After the ceremony, a captain handed me my commissioning documents. My hands didn't shake. My heart, which had been racing for days, suddenly steadied. The gold bars found my shoulders like they'd been promised that place all along, like they'd been waiting for me to grow into them. I stepped outside into the bright, unforgiving sun and saluted the sky I'd chosen, the vast blue expanse that was now mine to serve. No music, no confetti, no celebration. Just a quiet vow I made to myself: if blood wouldn't claim me, I'd let duty do it. If family wouldn't acknowledge what I'd become, I'd build a new one from the people who stood beside me when it mattered. They tell you your first night in basic training is the hardest because it's the last one you'll ever sleep as a civilian. They're wrong. It's the first morning that truly breaks you, the sound of the whistle cutting through darkness. The bark of orders before your eyes are fully open. The sudden, brutal realization that the world you knew no longer bends to accommodate your comfort or your name. I woke up at 5 that first morning in a dorm that smelled of starch and nervous sweat. 40 bunks, 40 strangers who would become brothers and sisters or wash out trying. One truth already forming in the humid air. The military doesn't care what story brought you here. It only cares how you stand in formation once you arrive. The first thing I learned was pace, how to move with purpose without rushing. How to be exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there. The second was silence, not the absence of sound. But the presence of control, knowing when to speak and when to let your actions carry the message. The third was that leadership doesn't shout. It commands gravity. You could spot the real officers in the making not by how loud they yelled, but by how still others grew around them, drawn to that center of calm in the chaos. I wanted to be that kind of still. It didn't come easy. Nothing there did. The Air Force Academy was designed to strip you down to nothing and rebuild you from the foundation up. Every mistake had a witness. Every triumph came with an asterisk. My body adjusted faster than my heart. During inspections, I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and see my mother's eyes inside the frame of my father's discipline, that strange combination that was uniquely mine. That contradiction that had defined my entire life. That contradiction became my armor. By senior year, I'd learned how to fold my emotions as neatly as my dress blues, how to tuck away the hurt and doubt and present only the surface that could withstand scrutiny. I didn't win most likely to command. I won most reliable under fire. It suited me better. My first posting came with sand, static, and the constant sound of helicopter rotors beating the air into submission. Qatar, 2006, I was a second lieutenant managing air support coordination for field units operating across the Afghan border. Most days blurred into a rhythm of radio calls and spreadsheets, logistics and briefings, the mundane work that keeps wars running but rarely makes headlines. But once in a while, the ground would crack open and everything would sharpen into focus. That happened on a Tuesday in June. Temperature well over 100 degrees. A convoy trapped outside Kandahar. Ambush. 8 men pinned down in a position that was rapidly deteriorating. I directed 3 sorties, coordinated evacuation procedures, and stayed on communications for 6 straight hours. My voice never wavered. I never raised it above the volume necessary to be heard clearly over the static and chaos. Later, when everyone was accounted for and safe, the ground team leader sent back a simple message through official channels. Whoever that woman on the radio was, she saved our lives. Tell her we won't forget. That night, someone painted Angel of Death on my locker door. Not as an insult, but as reverence a title earned in fire. At first, I hated it. Too grand, too mythic, too much pressure to carry. But after a while, I understood it wasn't really about me. It was about the men and women who needed to believe that someone above the noise, someone with a clear head and steady voice, could guide them home when everything went wrong. They needed to believe in angels because the alternative was believing they were alone in hell. The colonel heard about it, of course. Word travels through the ranks faster than orders. He called me out of the blue one evening, his voice tight and controlled. "They're calling you that?" he asked. "Angel of Death?" "Yes, sir," I said, my tone professional, distant. Silence stretched between us like barbed wire, sharp and impassable. "They romanticize killers too easily," he said finally. "It wasn't about killing, Dad. It was about direction. About bringing people home alive." He didn't answer. The line clicked dead. That was the last time we spoke for years. The silence that followed felt different from the ones before, more final. More chosen, more like a door closing that neither of us rushed to open again. The following winter, we lost a pilot on approach. The weather turned without warning. Radar failed at the worst possible moment. And I was the last voice he heard. I replayed that call in my head every night for months, analyzing every word, every inflection, looking for what I could have done differently. "Level out, Captain." "We've got you." Static crackle. "Captain, do you read?" More static. Then silence, the kind that never ends, that echoes forever. They gave me a commendation for professionalism under pressure. I accepted it without smiling. Professionalism felt like a hollow word for what had actually happened that night. When the deployment ended, I flew home through Frankfurt. At baggage claim, exhausted and numb, an older man in a worn ball cap approached me. He looked at my uniform, at the patches and insignia that told their own story. "Are you one of those angels?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The ones who talk the boys home?" I nodded politely, unsure what else to do. "My nephew made it out of that convoy near Kandahar." His eyes filled with tears. "He said your voice was the only thing keeping him together. Thank you. Thank you for bringing him home." I didn't know what to do with gratitude that enormous, that raw. So I saluted him, this civilian grandfather who'd probably never served but had sacrificed just the same, and walked away before he could see my own eyes water. Back stateside, I rotated through bases like chapters in an autobiography I was writing without quite realizing it. Travis. Shaw. Rammstein. Bagram again. The uniform aged faster than I did. Fabric wearing thin in places where I carried weight. Promotions came like bruises, you didn't feel them at first. Only later when you touched the tender spot and remembered what caused it. Captain. Major. Each new rank brought more responsibility, more people depending on decisions I made in split seconds, more weight to carry when those decisions had consequences I couldn't control. The nickname followed me everywhere, appearing in personnel files and unofficial conversations. Once, a reporter wanted to write a profile titled, "The Angel of Death Wears Lipstick." I declined. The work was serious. The press wanted mythology, a simplified story that fit neatly into headlines and social media posts. They wanted someone to celebrate or criticize, not the complicated reality of what command actually meant. Still, somewhere between the headlines I refused and the silence I maintained, I began to feel invisible again, celebrated and erased at the same time, turned into a symbol instead of seen as a person. It was around then I met the people who had become my second family. Team 47, a mix of airmen and Marines stationed at alive.Then. We ran operations together, ate from the same rations that all tasted like cardboard and regret, finished each other's radio codes without thinking. When things went sideways, when the situation deteriorated and decisions needed to be made fast, they didn't ask who was in charge. They just looked at me. That kind of trust is currency. You spend it wisely. You never waste it. One night, under a sky so full of stars it felt like you could reach up and touch eternity, one of the sergeants asked, "You ever scared, Mom?" "Always," I said honestly. "I just walk faster than my fear." He nodded, thoughtful, processing that. My dad used to say courage isn't the absence of fear. It's fear with better posture. We laughed until the generator noise drowned us out, until the moment passed and we returned to the serious business of staying alive and bringing others home safe. That same sergeant lost his leg 2 weeks later in an IED strike. I wrote his mother a letter, the kind where every sentence feels like trespassing on private grief, where words feel inadequate and insufficient, but you write them anyway because silence would be worse. At the end, I wrote, he never backed down, not even when the ground opened up beneath him. His courage had perfect posture. The colonel didn't reach out when that story made military headlines. But my stepbrother, his legitimate son, the one he'd raised properly, sent an email. Brief, cold, carrying his father's voice like a virus. Dad read the article about Sergeant Martinez. He says at least you finally found something you're good at. I didn't reply. Some silences don't need breaking. Some distances are better left unmeasured. By the time I hit my 30s, I'd built a reputation as the officer you called when things were already burning, when the situation had degraded past the point where protocol helped, and you needed someone who could think clearly through smoke and chaos. People called me calm under pressure, cold in crisis. I wasn't cold. I was composed. There's a difference, though few people see it. Cold doesn't care. Composed cares so much it has to maintain control or risk falling apart entirely. Command came next, larger responsibilities, broader scope. Okinawa, where the ocean spoke a language I was learning to understand. Then back to the States for what felt like both a reward and an exile teaching at Langley's Leadership Development Program. It was during that quieter assignment that I met Grant, civilian, paramedic, a man with steady hands and a calm voice who'd seen his own share of chaos and knew how to exist in the aftermath. He looked at me and saw not the uniform, not the legend, not the daughter with the famous father or the officer with the viral photo, just a person. Just Marlowe. When he proposed, he didn't kneel. He stood steady, equal eye to eye. "I want to build something with you," he said simply. "If you want that too." I sent one invitation to the wedding that gave me pause, that I debated over for weeks before finally addressing the envelope. It went to the colonel's address, written in my neatest block letters, the handwriting he'd made me practice until it was perfect. I didn't include a note, just the date, time, and place. Out of obligation, maybe? Out of hope, possibly. Out of the stubborn belief that blood should mean something, even when it never had before. He showed up. Civilian clothes, medals pinned to his lapel like declarations. He looked older, smaller somehow, but harder, as if age had compressed him into something denser, more concentrated. When he refused to walk me down the aisle, I wasn't surprised. When he called me what he did in front of everyone, I wasn't shocked hurt, yes, but not shocked. That was always who he was. But when those men and women stood for me, my unit, my team, my brothers and sisters in arms when they rose as one and offered their salutes like shields against his cruelty, that was the first time I felt the weight of the uniform as something truly holy. And in that silence, that profound electric silence that filled the tent like a presence, I realized something the academy never taught, that no amount of training could have prepared me for. You can win every medal, earn every promotion, prove yourself 1,000 times over and still be starving for a single word. Proud. I never heard it from him, but I heard it in the way my team saluted. I read it in their eyes as they stood when he expected me to crumble. And maybe, I thought as I turned back to the altar where Grant waited with understanding and love in his eyes, maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. The morning of the wedding, the air smelled like salt and possibility. The chapel sat on a small rise overlooking the Carolina coast, modest, intimate, built with clean lines and clear windows that let in all the light. I'd chosen it for its simplicity, not its grandeur. Grant called it peaceful. I called it neutral ground, a place where two different worlds could meet without one trying to dominate the other. The space hummed with quiet conversation. That low warmth that happens when people from vastly different backgrounds, uniform and civilian, military precision and ordinary life, try to share the same oxygen and find they can. My team from Langley had driven down together. A group of Marines from Okinawa had flown in despite the expense and difficulty. A cluster of Grant's family from Vermont made polite, earnest attempts at decoding the ranks displayed on dress blues, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than judgment. Every handshake began with a question, "How do you know the bride?" Every answer carried the same undercurrent of respect, not pity. That mattered more than I'd expected it to. My father arrived last. He always did. Arriving last meant everyone noticed, meant he could survey the room, meant he maintained control even in spaces that weren't his to command. He parked his black sedan right beside the chapel doors, as if proximity to the entrance could still be mistaken for importance, for belonging. When he stepped out, the world seemed to pause around him. Straight spine despite his age, slow deliberate gait, campaign medals aligned in perfect rows on his lapel, each one placed exactly where regulations specified, each one a story I'd never been invited to hear. He didn't look at me when he entered. He nodded once to the usher, a crisp military acknowledgement, then took his seat in the front row. Alone. No one sat beside him. I hadn't assigned anyone there and no one volunteered. When the music started, I didn't expect nerves. I'd faced ambushes where split-second decisions meant life or death. I'd coordinated airstrikes while bullets pinged off nearby structures. I'd given press briefings to rooms full of skeptical journalists looking for any sign of weakness. This should have been easy, just walking, just saying words I'd practiced. But as the doors opened and every guest rose to their feet, my pulse hit the tempo of helicopter rotors, that rhythmic thunder that had become the soundtrack to half my adult life. I felt the weight of my white dress uniform, not just the fabric, but everything it represented. The medals stitched precisely to my chest, the 4-rank bars glinting under the morning light. This wasn't lace and silk and tradition. This was a lifetime pressed into fabric. This was every choice I'd made, every battle I'd fought, every person who'd told me I didn't belong standing up anyway. Halfway down the aisle, my eyes met Grant's. Steady. Kind. The kind of gaze that builds bridges instead of walls, that offers partnership instead of ownership. Then I caught my father's expression or lack of one. Nothing. No pride, no disdain, no emotion at all. Just that cold calculation I'd known my entire life. The look he gave faulty equipment or underperforming soldiers. Assessment without attachment. The ceremony went smoothly. My voice didn't tremble through the vows. Grant's hands were steady and warm when he slipped the ring on my finger. For a few precious moments, I thought just maybe the day would pass quietly. That we could celebrate this beginning without having to confront the past. Then came the reception. We'd chosen the Officers' Club for its history wood floors polished by decades of boots. Framed photographs on the walls showing faces long gone but never forgotten. A weight of tradition that felt appropriate, respectful. Toasts began light and sincere. A Marine from my first tour told a story about the night I made him dump his smuggled whiskey to save a flight schedule the next morning. How I'd been fair but firm. How he'd hated me for approximately 12 hours and then realized I'd saved him from a career-ending mistake. Laughter rolled through the room like a wave. I exhaled, letting my shoulders drop for the first time all day. Maybe we'd made it through. Maybe the day would end with joy instead of pain. Then, from the head table, my father's glass struck crystal with deliberate force. 1 tap, 2, 3. A sound that silenced conversations faster than any shouted order could have. He stood slowly, painfully, as if the act of rising cost him something he wasn't sure he wanted to spend. He lifted his glass halfway, not in celebration, but in challenge. And then he said it. That bastard child still thinks she's one of us. For one heartbeat, nobody processed it. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon, visible but not quite real. Then came the ripple effect. Gasps cut short, smiles freezing mid-expression, the metallic sound of a dropped fork hitting a plate. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat, trapped between disbelief and déjà vu. It was every insult he'd ever whispered in private. Every cruel assessment delivered behind closed doors. Now weaponized in front of the only people who'd ever seen me as complete, as whole, as worthy. Grant started to rise beside me, his chair scraping back, his face flushed with protective anger. I stopped him with a hand on his arm, firm pressure that said, "Wait, let me handle this." Across the table, my best man, that same Marine I'd once dragged from wreckage, whose life I'd saved and who'd never forgotten, stood first. His movement was slow, deliberate, unmistakable in its intention. His salute was quiet but perfect, every element exact, every angle precise. Then others followed. Not rushed, not performative, but like a wave building strength as it rolled forward. Within seconds, the room was transforming, chairs sliding back, boots finding the floor, spines straightening, shoulders squaring. 40 men and women who'd served with me, who'd seen me at my best and worst, who knew exactly what I'd earned, stood at attention and offered their salutes like shields, like swords, like the answer to a question that had been asked for 30 years. My father sat back down heavily. Colour drained from his face, leaving him pale and diminished. He stared not at me, but through me, past me, at something only he could see. Maybe his own reflection in this moment. Maybe the realization of what he'd just done and what it had cost him. The room held that silence for what felt like forever. No applause came. No one spoke. Just that electric, profound quiet that carries more weight than any noise could. I nodded once to my team, to the people who'd chosen to stand when they could have stayed seated. Then I turned to the band, my voice emerging steady and clear. "Play the next song." The music started again. Slowly, carefully, conversations resumed like water finding its way around an obstacle. But something had shifted in that room, something permanent and powerful. That night, after the guests had departed and the venue fell quiet, the photographer sent preview shots to my phone. There it was, the moment frozen in digital clarity. Me standing tall at the center, a sea of uniforms saluting in perfect formation around me. My father, a shadow at the edge of the frame, lips pressed tight, face drawn. Suddenly small in a room full of people who'd made a choice about what they valued, about who deserved their respect. The picture would go viral within 24 hours. Military blogs would call it the salute heard around the corps. Civilian outlets would frame it as a daughter's defiance, a generational conflict, a moment of justice. But for me, it wasn't defiance. It was grief captured mid-air. It was the death of hope I'd been carrying for 30 years, the hope that someday, somehow, he'd see me. Really see me. Grant found me hours later, still in uniform, sitting by the window and staring at that photograph on my phone's glowing screen. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, knowing the answer but asking anyway because sometimes people need the question. I shook my head slowly. "No, but I'm something close to it." He sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. "You didn't deserve that." "I know," I said quietly, still looking at the photo. But he did what he's always done. He turned love into a test. And when I passed every test, he just made new ones. Tests designed so I'd fail, so he could prove he'd been right all along. The days that followed felt surreal. Every news outlet wanted a quote, an interview, a statement. My phone rang constantly. Emails flooded my inbox. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out to say they'd seen it. They couldn't believe it. They were proud of me. They wanted to share their own stories of fathers who couldn't love right, of families that failed them. I refused them all. Every single one. The story wasn't about a viral moment. It wasn't about winning some cultural battle or making a political point. It was about the decades before that moment, the silence that had built it brick by brick, the small cruelties that had accumulated until they became a wall neither of us could see over. A week later, a letter arrived from my stepbrother, written on expensive stationery in careful handwriting. He says you embarrassed him in front of men who'd actually earned their place. He says you've always been more concerned with appearances than with family. He thinks you should apologize. I folded the letter carefully, walked to the kitchen, and threw it in the trash. Then I took the trash outside so I wouldn't have to look at it anymore. The next morning, I ran 5 miles before sunrise. The ocean wind was cold enough to sting my eyes clear, to remind me I was alive and free and no longer bound to the past in the ways I'd once believed I was. At work, my unit greeted me differently. Not with pity, none of them would dare offer that, but with a sharpened respect. An understanding that hadn't existed before. They'd known I was competent, professional, reliable. Now they knew something deeper about where that competence had come from, what it had cost to build. One of my subordinates, a young lieutenant from Texas with an accent that reminded me of home in all the best ways, left a sticky note on my desk. Simple words in blue ink, sometimes bloodstains. Sometimes it salutes. Proud to serve under you, ma'am. That note stayed on my desk for years, through 3 office changes and 2 promotions. Grant and I didn't take a honeymoon right away. Duty called it always did. An ethics summit in Brussels. A training rotation in Alaska. The usual parade of commitments that fill a soldier's calendar, that make planning anything personal feel like negotiating with fate. When we finally took a week off in Maine, a small cabin on the coast, nothing fancy, just quiet and time, Grant asked if I'd heard from my father. No, I said. He nodded, stirring sugar into his morning coffee. Good. You think so? Yeah. He looked at me over the rim of his mug. Some silences are gifts, some distances are protection. That night, when I closed my eyes to sleep, I saw that frozen image again, one man seated, everyone else standing. But for the first time, it wasn't the insult that replayed in my mind. It was the silence after. The powerful, unified silence that had said more than any words could. The sound of people choosing in real time what they stood for, who they stood with. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life continued in that inexorable way it does, whether you're ready or not. Then came another call. Morning light. Unknown number. Roanoke area code. My hand hovered over the screen, that old instinct to ignore it warring with something else, curiosity maybe, or duty, or the stubborn belief that some chapters need proper endings. I answered. Is this Major Hayes? The voice was female, professional, careful. Yes, I said, my tone snapping automatically to attention, to the formal voice I used for official business. This is Captain Rodriguez from the VA hospital in Roanoke. Your father's had a stroke. The words didn't land at first. They hovered in the air, weightless and strange, like messages from another language I used to speak but had forgotten. How bad? I asked, reverting to the clipped efficiency of military briefings. Significant. Right-side paralysis. Speech impairment. He's stable now, but it was serious. He's been asking for someone, though his speech is limited. We found your name in his contact information. I wrote down the room number with hands that didn't shake, thanked her for the call in a voice that didn't waver, and sat there for a long moment after hanging up, staring at the notepad where I'd written VA Hospital and Room 312 in my neat, precise handwriting, the handwriting he'd taught me. Grant found me like that 20 minutes later, still holding the pen, still staring at those words. What happened? He asked. I told him. The words came out flat, factual, stripped of emotion because emotion felt dangerous right then. Felt like something that might overwhelm me if I let it in. Are you going? His hand came to rest on my shoulder, warm and solid. I don't know. He didn't push. He never did. He just said quietly, don't go for him. Go for you. So, either way, that you made a choice instead of letting the choice make you. The drive back to Virginia took 13 hours through the night. Just me, the highway, and the endless white lines disappearing under my headlights. I didn't listen to music. I didn't listen to podcasts or audiobooks. Just the sound of tires on asphalt and the rhythm of my own breathing, steady and controlled because control was all I had left. I hadn't been back to Roanoke in years. The town looked smaller, flatter, as if someone had folded it into itself, compressing it down to something manageable and sad. The streets I'd grown up on seemed narrower. The houses I'd thought were grand looked modest and worn. At the hospital, The same smell greeted me that I remembered from childhood visits with Mom antiseptic, trying to mask something deeper. Something that smelled like illness and time running out. The nurse at the desk looked up, saw my uniform, and straightened slightly in that automatic way civilians do around military. "Room 312, I asked. She pointed down a hallway painted that particular shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature. "He's alert but limited," she said softly, her voice carrying more gentleness than the information required. "Speech may be slurred. He's been asking for someone, but we couldn't quite make out the name." I nodded, my chest feeling hollow, and walked down that hallway with footsteps that sounded too loud in the quiet, each one echoing like a drumbeat counting down to something I wasn't ready for. When I stepped into the room, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who'd once filled every doorway, who'd seemed larger than life and twice as permanent, now looked like a shadow that had been cut loose from its owner and left to fade. His right arm lay motionless against white sheets. His face was slack on one side, asymmetrical in a way that made him look unfamiliar. His medals weren't on his chest anymore. They sat on the nightstand, neatly arranged as if waiting for inspection, as if even now there were standards to maintain. He turned his head when he heard the door open. One eye tracked me immediately. The other lagged behind, uncertain and slow. His mouth worked to form a word that wouldn't quite come together. "Dad," I said quietly, testing the word in my mouth, tasting it after years of avoiding it. He blinked once. Then again, for the first time in 30 years of looking at him, I didn't see authority. I didn't see the wall I'd spent my life trying to climb. I saw effort, painful, human, unguarded effort just to stay present, just to be here in this moment. He pointed with his good hand, the left one, clumsy and unpracticed, toward a notepad beside the bed. I handed it to him along with a pen. His hand trembled as he wrote, each letter a small victory against the body that was betraying him. 3 words, crooked but clear. "You stood tall." I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness, not yet, maybe never, but something. Grief, maybe. Or mercy. The kind of mercy that comes from seeing someone stripped of everything they used to hide behind. I sat down in the chair beside his bed, unsure what to do with my hands, with the silence, with this new configuration of who we were to each other. "How bad is it?" I asked. He tapped the pen against the bed once, twice a rhythm that might have been Morse code or just the beating of a heart that kept going despite everything. Then he scribbled slowly, "Could be worse." That was the most him thing he could have written. Even here, even broken, still maintaining that stoic front, that refusal to admit weakness. We didn't talk long that first visit. A nurse came in, adjusted the IV line, smiled politely at me with the kind of smile that said she'd heard about me, knew something about our story without knowing the details. When she left, the silence between us felt different than it used to, less hostile, more just, empty. A space that could be filled or left alone. He gestured again toward the nightstand. There, beneath the carefully arranged medals, was a folded piece of paper. Yellowed edges. Soft from handling. I picked it up carefully, unfolding it with the kind of reverence you'd give to something fragile and precious. It was the photograph. The wedding photograph. The salute. I looked back at him, something caught in my throat. "You kept this?" He nodded. Slow. Painful. His eyes glistened not with tears but with something heavier. Something that had been building for years and finally found permission to show. He tapped the image where my team stood frozen in their salutes, then tapped his own chest with his good hand. His voice came out like sandpaper over stone, barely more than a whisper, each word costing him something should have. Stood. That was all he managed before exhaustion claimed him, pulling him back down into sleep or something like it. I sat there a while longer after his eyes closed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the steady beep of monitors measuring a heartbeat that was still strong despite everything else breaking down. The machines kept time like metronomes for memories I wasn't ready to fully examine yet. I wanted to tell him things. About the letters I'd written and never sent. About the medals he'd never seen me receive. About the peace I'd started to build without his approval. The life I'd made that was good and meaningful and mine. But he was already somewhere else. Drifting between consciousness and absence, and my words would have to wait. When I finally left, I paused at the door and looked back at him small in that hospital bed. Reduced to the basic elements of being human. Fragile. Mortal. No longer the towering figure who'd defined so much of my life by his absence of approval. I wanted to salute him. The muscle memory was there, the instinct trained into me over decades. But the gesture felt wrong somehow, unfinished, like a sentence missing its period. Instead, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Rest easy, Colonel. In the parking lot, dusk was settling over Roanoke like a blanket. The Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance were turning that particular shade of blue-grey that had coloured my childhood, that still appeared in my dreams sometimes. I called Grant. He's alive, I said. Are you okay? I don't know, I said. Those 3 words I'd been saying my whole life. The truest answer I'd ever known. It's like seeing a monument crumble. Like watching something you thought was permanent turn out to be temporary after all. Then maybe, Grant said gently, his voice carrying that steady wisdom I'd fallen in love with. Maybe it's time to stop worshipping monuments. Maybe it's time to just see him as a man. Flawed. Human. Someone who got some things very wrong. His words stayed with me during the entire drive home, echoing in the cab of my truck like a truth I'd known but never quite been able to articulate. For weeks afterward, I carried that photograph folded in my wallet not as proof anymore, not as a weapon to wave or a shield to hide behind. It had transformed into something else. A map, maybe. One that didn't point backward to where I'd been, but forward to where I could choose to go, towards something quieter than vindication, towards something more sustaining than being right. When the VA called again 2 months later, it wasn't an emergency. The nurse's voice was warm, almost friendly. Your father's in rehabilitation now, she said. Making progress, slow but steady. He asks about you sometimes. Doesn't say much, speech is still difficult, but he keeps that picture you saw by his bed. Looks at it often. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat for a long time in the darkness of my office. Behind me, my own medals gleamed faintly in the cabinet, catching light from the hallway. My reflection in the glass looked like both of us somehow his strong jawline, my mother's thoughtful eyes, the posture of someone who'd been fighting a war long after the official ceasefire was declared. And I realized something in that moment, something that felt like the beginning of wisdom. Forgiveness isn't surrender. It's strategic retreat. It's choosing peace not because the war was won or lost, but because the war has stopped making sense. Because continuing to fight costs more than you're willing to pay. A month later, I mailed him a postcard. It had a lighthouse on the front, standing solid against storm-dark seas, a cliché maybe, but also true in the way the best clichés are. On the back, I wrote just 5 words, still standing. Hope you are too. No rank. No signature. No claim or demand or question. Just that acknowledgement of survival, of still being here despite everything. He never wrote back. But I like to think he read it the way he used to read field reports carefully. Twice pretending the words didn't matter while memorizing everyone. The letter came on a Tuesday. Postmarked Roanoke. The handwriting achingly familiar, those squared-off capitals. No curves. No softness. Everything at right angles like a blueprint for emotional distance. The return address was the VA rehab wing. Inside was a single page and 4 words that looked like they'd been written with immense concentration. Each letter a small battle against trembling fingers. If possible, come alone. No signature. He didn't need one. I'd know his handwriting anywhere, even now when it was shakier. Less certain, marked by the stroke that had taken so much from him. Grant read it over my shoulder, then set his hand on the back of my neck in that grounding way he had, warm and solid and present. You don't owe him anything, he said gently, but there was no judgment in it, no pressure either way. I know, I said, but I might owe myself a clean ending, or at least an honest one. Endings are supposed to be tidy, I added after a moment. This won't be. The important ones never are, Grant said. I drove before dawn, my headlights cutting through the pre-morning darkness. A thermos of coffee cooling too fast in the cup holder. The sky over the Blue Ridge was the colour of an old bruised purple and grey and tender. I listened to nothing on the drive. No music, no news, no podcasts. Just the kind of profound quiet where thoughts arrange themselves into formations, where clarity comes whether you want it or not. Somewhere around Lexington, I realised I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I wasn't preparing arguments or defences or accusations. I was rehearsing silence, the kind you offer when you finally understand you can't carry someone else's history for them, when you've stopped trying to fix what was broken before you were even born. The rehab centre was a squat brick building with an American flag out front, and a bronze plaque by the door honouring donors whose names I'd never know but whose generosity had created this space for healing. Inside, everything smelled like industrial lemon cleaner and determination. That particular scent of places where people work hard to reclaim pieces of themselves they'd thought were lost forever. A volunteer at the front desk, an older woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read, Dorothy, pointed me down a corridor painted that shade of green they choose when they've run out of colours that don't offend anyone. Room 112, she said. He's been waiting. The door was open. He was sitting upright in a chair by the window, not lying in bed this time. A blanket lay across his lap. A plastic brace supported his right wrist. The stroke had thinned him further, sanded away the sharp edges without softening them, leaving something harder to define, less imposing but somehow more present. He turned at the sound of my boots on the tile floor. For a brief, disorienting second, I saw him as I had when I was 10 years old, enormous, indestructible. A wall that made the world feel both smaller and safer. A man who seemed to contain entire wars inside his silence. Then the present reasserted itself with gentle force. Skin papery and pale. Hair gone the colour of surrendered metal. The lines on his face not just from age, but from battles I'd never be privy to. From wounds that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Colonel, I said. It came out automatically, decades of habit. He tried to smile. The right corner of his mouth lagged behind, stubborn. He tapped the empty chair beside him with 2 fingers of his good hand, then gestured at the window with a slight tilt of his head. Outside, a therapy garden waited for spring beds still bare, soil dark and rich but empty, trellises standing like promises not yet kept. He picked up a pen with his left hand, the movement clumsy and unpracticed, and pointed at a yellow legal pad on the small table between our chairs. He wrote slowly, each letter requiring focus. Thanks for coming. You asked, I said simply. I could manage that much. He underlined the words he'd written, then added below them, his hand shaking slightly, wanted to, before it all. The pen stalled at the edge of the sentence like it had run into a border it couldn't cross, a truth too big to fit into words. He set down the pen, looked at me directly for the first time and tried his voice. It came out rough, gravelly, each word requiring visible effort. Can't say it right. That never stopped you before, I said. The words came out sharper than I intended, old reflexes having long half-lives. Something like amusement flickered across his eyes, quick there and gone, but real. He nodded slightly, as if accepting a hit he'd earned, as if acknowledging that fair was fair. He took a breath that sounded measured and small, like he was rationing even his oxygen. I was wrong, he said, fighting the shape of each word like a man dragging a loaded sled uphill through snow. About you. I waited. The silence stretched between us, elastic and fragile. I'd learned long ago that some silences need to be left alone, that rushing to fill them destroys whatever's trying to be born in that empty space. He gestured toward the nightstand with his good hand. The laminated wedding photo lay there, corners worn from being handled too often, edges soft from being looked at in moments when no one else was watching. He tapped the image of the men and women frozen in their salutes, then tapped his own chest twice with his forefinger. A soldier's mime, a wordless confession. His jaw worked, muscles tightening and releasing. The words weren't cooperating, weren't forming the way they used to when commands came crisp and immediate. I found myself supplying them without consciously deciding to. You should have stood, I said quietly. His eyes closed a flinch that was more prayer than pain, more shame than suffering. When he opened them again, they were wet. Not dramatically, not performatively, just damp with the kind of tears that come from deep places, from cracks in foundations you thought were solid. He nodded once, definitive. Pride, he forced out, pressing the syllable flat, making it sound like the accusation it was against himself, not me. Wrong kind. We sat with that truth. In rehab facilities, time isn't measured by clocks on walls. It's measured by repetition, squeeze, release, hold, let go. Progress counted in inches and moments and tiny victories that seem insignificant unless you're the one fighting for them. He reached for the pad again, concentration lifting his left shoulder a fraction as he leaned forward. The pen moved slowly across the page. I thought hardness meant strength, he wrote, then paused before adding a line that shifted something in my chest, that made breathing feel different. Didn't see how much you were carrying. He stopped, seemed to gather himself, then added one more line in handwriting that got shakier with each word. I made you prove yourself to emptiness. The precision of it struck me how exactly right those words were, how they named something I'd felt but never been able to articulate. Proving myself to emptiness. fighting for approval that was never there to win. It was never empty, I said finally, my voice steady but quiet. Just cold. He winced at the truth, or maybe at the effort of hearing it, of holding it. Or both. Your mother, he said, the two words landing heavy between us. Weighted with everything he'd never said about her, about them, about the choices he'd made that had shaped all our lives. Wouldn't have liked what I became. She did like you, I said, surprised by the gentleness in my own voice. For a while. Long enough to believe you might change. Long enough to give me life. Long enough, he echoed, and something eased in his shoulders. Some tension he'd been carrying for decades finally finding permission to release. The way snow surrenders when spring's sun insists, slowly and then all at once. We talked after that, not fluently, not easily, but we talked. The way people reach toward each other across distance slowly, carefully, aware of all the ways they might fumble or fail. He told me about rehab in clipped pieces, fragments that I had to assemble into meaning. The indignity of being dressed by strangers. The unexpected holiness of taking a first step that didn't hurt. He pointed toward the parallel bars in the therapy gym down the hall. I could see them through the window and managed, with a pride that didn't curdle into arrogance, walked 8 feet yesterday. That's a new war, I observed. Different ground, he agreed. And the word agreed hearing him use it. Hearing him acknowledge that my perspective had value sounded like a country neither of us had ever visited before. At one point, a physical therapist knocked and poked her head into the room. She was young, maybe late 20s, with a tattoo of an anchor peeking from under her sleeve and bright, intelligent eyes that took in the scene quickly. She smiled at me with immediate recognition. I saw you speak in DC, Mom, she said, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. That leadership panel. Honor beyond blood. You made my dad cry, and he's a welder from Toledo who thinks tears are a leak in the plumbing. I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound surprising in its genuineness, its ease. The therapist turned to my father, her expression respectful but confident. Your daughter's the real deal, sir, she said firmly. None of that motivational poster nonsense that sounds good but means nothing. Just the hard kind of truth that actually helps people. After she left, we returned to our private battlefield, but it felt different now. Less like combat and more like negotiation. More like two people trying to find common ground in territory neither of them had mapped before. He fumbled for words again, his good hand tightening on the armrest of his chair. I trained men, he said slowly, each word requiring focus and breath. Didn't know how to. Raise a daughter. I let that sentence sit between us, not accepting it as excuse, but acknowledging it as truth. There's a difference. You raised a soldier, I said finally, my voice even. And then you punished me for surviving your curriculum, for excelling at everything you taught me, but never gave me permission to become. He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, there was no defense in his expression, no argument forming, no wall being constructed. Just the soft, stunned look of a man who's found a document he didn't realize he'd lost, who's reading words he wrote but had forgotten, words that indict him in ways he can't deny. I was afraid, he said, and the admission sounded so unnatural coming from him. So unlike every version of himself he'd ever presented, that the room seemed to shift around it, the air rearranging itself to accommodate this new truth of being small. You made me feel small. The silence that followed was profound, heavy. I let it exist without rushing to fill it, without offering false comfort or empty reassurance. I didn't make you feel small, I said eventually, carefully choosing each word with the precision he'd taught me. The truth did. The truth that you'd built your whole identity on being the standard, on being the measure everyone else failed against. And when I met that standard, when I exceeded it, it meant your measuring stick was wrong. It meant you'd have to rethink everything. He sat with that, processing, his face working through emotions I'd never seen him display openly. Finally, he nodded just once, but it was a nod of acceptance, of acknowledgement, of something that might eventually become understanding. We were quiet after that for a long time. Not the hostile silence of my childhood. Not the cold distance that had defined our relationship for decades. This was different, a silence that wasn't absence but structure. Like the frame of a house before the walls go up, before you can see what it will become, but you can sense its shape, its possibility. He gestured for the pad one more time. His hand shook as he wrote, and I could see the effort it took, the concentration required for something that used to be automatic. Can we start somewhere? he wrote, the letters uneven but clear. Then below it, not over. Just somewhere. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to scale him, to plant a flag where approval should have been, to prove I was worthy of the title daughter that he'd never been willing to grant. I thought about the photograph in his wallet that he'd sent back unopened. I thought about the wedding photo he'd kept, that he'd looked at often enough to wear the corners soft. I thought about my mother's last words to me before I left for basic training, keep flying. And remember, sometimes flight isn't just about ascending. Sometimes it's about choosing where to land. Somewhere is reasonable, I said carefully, offering him what felt like more than I'd planned but less than forgiveness. Something in between that had its own name I hadn't learned yet. Somewhere is a place we can both reach. He nodded like a recruit who's finally been given an order he understands, who sees a path forward even if it's difficult. His left hand lifted half an inch from the blanket, hesitated there, decades of pride and stubbornness, warring with something newer, something that looked almost like humility and then opened. An unpracticed request, an offering. I placed my hand over his, warm, fragile, human. No medals between us, no uniforms, no ranks, just a father and daughter, both damaged in different ways, both trying to find their way towards something that might, eventually, with time and effort and grace, resemble peace. When it was time for me to leave, visiting hours ending, his exhaustion showing in the slump of his shoulders, he struggled with the brace on his wrist, with the blanket across his lap, with the gravity of the moment and everything it represented. Wait, he said, the syllable coming out crisp and clear for once, cutting through the other difficulties of speech. He pushed himself taller in the chair, his chin lifting that crucial degree that made me see the ghost of the officer he'd been, the commander who'd led men through impossible situations. The right hand wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't move the way memory insisted it should, so he used his left hand instead. Awkward, imperfect, unpracticed. He brought 2 fingers to his brow in a salute that would have failed any inspection, that violated probably a dozen regulations. That was technically wrong in almost every way. And it passed every test that actually mattered. I returned it, slowly, deliberately, not out of rank or duty or obligation, but out of recognition of effort, of attempt, of the courage it took to offer respect when you'd spent a lifetime withholding it. At the door, I paused and turned back. For what it's worth, I said, I learned a lot from you. How to stand straight, how to endure, how to keep going when everything in you wants to quit. He managed a half smile, that left side of his mouth cooperating where the right wouldn't. Me too, he said, the words coming easier now, as if practice was helping. Then, with a small wry effort that sounded almost like the man who used to tap his watch at me when I was running late, next time, bring coffee. Black. 2 sugars, I corrected, remembering. His eyes widened, slightly surprise or pleasure or both. He nodded. Deal. A truce. Sealed in caffeine and small mercies. Outside, the afternoon air had sharpened, carrying the clean bite of early spring. A young veteran in a wheelchair rolled past me toward the therapy garden, sleeves pinned neatly where his arms ended below the elbows. He was humming under his breath, tuneless and off-key and thoroughly alive. I stood there a moment longer, feeling the shape of that imperfect salute settling into my bones, like a weight I no longer needed to carry alone, like something that had finally found its proper place. On the drive home, I called Grant. We found a start, I said when he answered. How does it feel? Like a broken thing remembering how to hold weight, I said, searching for the right words. Not fixed, not healed, but held. Like maybe healing can happen now that we're both willing to try. He exhaled and I could hear the smile in his voice. That's enough for now. That's actually more than enough. At a gas station outside Charlottesville, I bought 2 coffees from the convenience store, both black, both with 2 sugars added. I labelled one lid with a Sharpie marker Colonel. Black. The cashier raised an eyebrow, curious but too polite to ask. Long drive ahead, I said. Looks like a longer road behind you, she observed with the kind of wisdom that comes from standing behind a register and watching humanity pass by for years. I nodded. Getting shorter, though, mile by mile. When I got home, I slid the extra cup into the refrigerator, saving it for the next visit. Grant glanced at it when he opened the fridge for milk, then looked at me with a question in his eyes. I shrugged. He asked, I said simply. We ate dinner in companionable quiet, the kind of silence that comes from being comfortable together. from not needing to fill every moment with words. Later, I stood at the kitchen window, evening settling over our street like a flag being lowered after taps, slow, reverent, final. I took the wedding photo from my wallet, where I'd been carrying it for months, and set it against the windowsill where the last light of day could catch it. In that frozen rectangle of time, men and women still stood for me, their salutes eternal and unwavering. Tonight, I realized, I was standing for both of us, for the daughter I'd been and the soldier I'd become, for the father who'd failed me and the man who was learning, finally, to try. Not because blood demanded it, but because honor, real honor, the kind that isn't performed but practiced, finally asked in a voice I could hear, in a language we were both learning to speak. Spring found its way into the rehab garden the way forgiveness finds its way into wounded hearts quietly. Root first, one small green shoot at a time. The bare beds I'd seen in March began pushing up shy hints of life in April. By May, the trellises carried actual weight, vines climbing towards sun with patient determination. I started driving down to Roanoke every other Sunday. I'd pack a small cooler bag with 2 coffees, both black with 2 sugars, exactly how we both liked them, and a pair of cinnamon rolls from a bakery that opened at dawn for fishermen and insomniacs, and people trying to make peace with their pasts. I never announced my visits. I just showed up. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat together while he worked through his physical therapy exercises. And I counted his steps between the parallel bars like they were measures in a song we were both learning to play. He kept trying the left-handed salute, getting a little better each time but never quite achieving the crisp precision he'd once demanded. I pretended not to notice how hard he worked at it, how much it mattered to him to get it right. When frustration burned through him, when his body refused to cooperate, when progress felt impossibly slow, he'd swear under his breath and then look at me like he expected to be written up for conduct unbecoming. I didn't write him up. I didn't lecture. I just said, new rules of engagement. You're allowed to be human now. One Sunday in late May, we wheeled his chair out to the garden and parked beside a bed of roses that were just beginning to bloom deep red and pink and yellow, their scent almost overwhelming in the warm air. A cardinal hopped along the fence rail like a sentry checking its post. I thought duty meant never needing, he said, the words coming more easily now after weeks of speech therapy, though still slower than they used to, never needing anyone, never needing help. I thought duty meant never asking, I answered, watching the cardinal. Never asking for what I needed, never admitting I needed anything at all. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sadder. We trained the wrong muscles, he said. Okay, I said, nodding toward the garden beds where new growth was pushing through soil. So we trained different ones. It's not too late. It wasn't a movie montage. Nothing was simple or fast or set to inspirational music. But somewhere between the coffee lids and the quiet Sunday walks, between the parallel bars and the therapy sessions, between the words that came hard and the silences that came easier, we started collecting small victories. One more step completed without assistance. One less apology swallowed before it could be spoken. One conversation that didn't end in walls being raised. He told me stories no one else had ever heard. About a night in 1971 when the rain in the jungle felt like a verdict being handed down. About a young private who cried in the supply closet because he missed his mother, and how he, the colonel, the commander, the man who demanded steel from his soldiers, had pretended not to see, had walked away instead of offering comfort, and how that moment had haunted him for decades. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was just filing his own report, finally, honestly. I shared things too. Not the medals or the headlines or the moments that made me look good. I told him about the failures that still visited me at 2 in the morning, about the pilot I couldn't bring down safely, whose last words still echoed in my dreams, about the letter I'd written to his widow that had run out of language 3 sentences in, how I'd sat at that desk for an hour trying to find words adequate to the weight of loss and found none, about how the word angel felt like an ill-fitting coat when what I'd carried that day was just a radio and someone else's desperate hope. He listened to each confession like it was a formal debrief. No interruptions, no attempts to fix or minimize or redirect, just that squared-off attention he'd once used as a weapon, now offered as something gentler as witness, as presence, as the simple gift of being heard. In mid-June, the VA hosted a family day. Burgers sizzling on a flat-top grill, country songs playing from a Bluetooth speaker. Children weaving through wheelchairs like minnows through reeds, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. A volunteer coordinator asked if the colonel wanted to say a few words to the gathered families. He looked at me, question in his eyes. I shook my head slightly, offering him a smile that tried to be gentle, that tried to say, "You don't have to perform anymore." He shook his right hand once, as if testing whether it would wake up, whether it would cooperate. Then he said clearly, to the coordinator, but also to me, to himself, to the years of rigid expectations he'd lived under, "Not yet." It was the first time I'd ever heard him choose not yet over never. The first time I'd heard him leave a door open instead of slamming it shut. Afterward, a veteran in a navy cap, weathered face, kind eyes, the look of someone who'd seen things he didn't talk about, rolled his wheelchair over to where we sat in the shade. "Your daughter saved my nephew," he told the colonel, his voice thick with emotion. "He was in that convoy near Kandahar. She was the voice on the radio that night. We don't forget voices like that. Voices that bring boys home." The colonel's throat worked visibly. He nodded to the man, accepting the information with the gravity it deserved. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, not in private, certainly never in public. Uncomplicated pride. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself or qualify itself or protect itself with conditions. He didn't say the word proud, but I could read it in every line of his face, in the way his eyes stayed on mine, steady and sure. And that was enough. After 30 years of searching, that was more than enough. Summer pressed on with humid determination. The news cycle moved past the wedding photo onto storms and elections, triumphs and scandals, the endless parade of American life happening elsewhere. But here, in our small corner of the world, something quieter was taking root. I kept teaching at Langley, kept accepting mentorship meetings even when my calendar protested. Young officers would show up with notebooks and nerves, ready to take notes on leadership and command. We talked about authority as stewardship rather than dominance, about the critical difference between performance and proof, about how a leader's silence can function as either shelter or storm, depending on how consciously it's wielded, how carefully it's chosen. If you're asking people to salute your rank, I told them, watching their pens move across paper, start by saluting their reality, their struggles, their humanity. Authority that ignores those things isn't leadership, it's just noise. Some of them wrote that down. I hoped more of them would actually practice it. The invitation to speak in DC came again in late September. Same forum, bigger venue this time. The topic, Honor Beyond Blood. Building cultures of respect in military service. I called the rehab center and asked if the colonel could travel if the journey would be too much, if his condition was stable enough. The nurse said yes, but with a detailed list of requirements that read like a mission planning checklist. Medications, wheelchair accessibility, regular rest periods, dietary considerations. He agreed to come with a grunt that meant, "Don't fuss over me," but I could hear something else underneath it: pleasure, maybe, or pride, or just the simple human desire to be included in his daughter's life. We arrived early. The auditorium smelled like new carpet and ambition, that particular scent of places where people gather hoping to learn something, to become something better than they were yesterday. I helped him settle into a seat near the aisle, the kind of position a soldier picks instinctively good sight lines. Easy exit if needed, tactical awareness even in civilian settings. He adjusted his jacket carefully, then his jaw, then gave me that look I recognized from childhood inspection face, but softer now, lacking the sting it used to carry. "You're ready," he said, his speech clear and strong. "Always," I answered, and for once the word meant prepared rather than armored, meant confidence rather than defense. I don't remember every word of that talk. Memory is selective that way, holding on to feelings more than specifics. But I remember how the room felt attentive without hunger, thoughtful without the kind of heat that distorts rather than illuminates. I spoke about the salute at my wedding, about what that moment had taught me about found family and earned respect, about how a single gesture can carry 1,000 quiet promises when it comes from people who've seen you at your worst and choose to stand anyway. I talked about how the loudest voice in your life isn't always the truest one, how sometimes the opinions that echo longest are the ones you need to learn to question, to examine, to eventually release. I mentioned my mother's soft doctrine, her teaching that strength can look like gentleness, that endurance can be quiet rather than loud, And my father's hard one, his insistence on discipline and structure and never showing weakness. Both ran through my veins like two rivers. I said, looking out at hundreds of faces, young and old, civilian and military. For years I thought they had to stay separate. That one had to win out over the other. But eventually I learned they could meet. They could merge into something new, something that had structure and discipline, but also mercy and recognition of human complexity. Near the end, I paused, gathering my thoughts, feeling the weight of what I wanted to say next. Family is the first command structure we learn, I said slowly. For better or worse, it teaches us what authority looks like, what respect means, what belonging costs. If that first family fails you, if blood doesn't offer what it should, you have two choices. You can spend your life trying to earn what was never yours to earn, what was never going to be freely given. Or you can build a new standard worth saluting. You can create family from the people who show up when it matters, who stand when others sit, who see your worth even when the ones who should have seen it first choose blindness. I let that sit for a moment, then added, and sometimes not always. But sometimes if you build that new standard strong enough, if you prove to yourself what you're worth, the original family might find their way back. Not to rule or to take credit or to claim they were right all along, but to learn, to witness, to finally see what was there the entire time. There was a pause after that, not dramatic or performative, just a moment of collective breath-holding, of people deciding something privately in the quiet space their own thoughts created. Then applause rose like a wave, filling the auditorium with sound that felt different from ordinary applause, warmer, more personal, carrying weight beyond politeness. The colonel didn't look at me during the applause. He looked straight ahead, his profile strong despite everything time and illness had taken from him. He let that wave of recognition wash over both of us, acknowledgement he hadn't earned but wouldn't waste. Respect offered not to him but to the relationship we were slowly, carefully building from wreckage. We didn't celebrate afterward with champagne or fancy dinners. We celebrated the way we did everything now, simply, honestly, without pretense. A diner with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like someone's grandmother had made it with love and low expectations. Pie that might not have been fancy but was real, made by actual human hands that day, in the booth's fluorescent light. His face looked different than it had in that hospital room months ago. Less stern, yes, but more than that, mapped differently. Lines where battles had been fought, softness where orders used to live. Evidence of a life being reconsidered in real time. He tapped his coffee cup with the back of his spoon, a small gesture, almost nervous. Proud, he said, testing the word like he was checking its weight. Its authenticity, whether it would hold under scrutiny. It did. The word held. The call came in late October. The nurse's voice was careful, measured, preparing me. Complication. Pneumonia. You should come soon. By the time I made it to Roanoke, driving through the night with my foot heavy on the gas pedal, the room had that particular quality of quiet, the kind that means time is running short, that mean things are ending whether you're ready or not. He didn't wake when I took his hand. I sat anyway, settling into the chair beside his bed for what I somehow knew would be the last time. I read to him from my mother's battered paperback poems about storms and birds in flight, about the work of staying present when everything in you wants to flee. When the monitor finally flattened into its long, uninterrupted tone, that sound that marks the end of heartbeat, the end of struggle, the end of trying, I pressed my fingers gently to his wrist, feeling for any remnant of pulse even though I knew there would be none. Then I stood, straight-backed, and gave him the salute we'd both learned to mean something new. Left-handed, imperfect, but offered with everything I had. You taught me how to stand, I whispered to the stillness. Even if you didn't always stand with me, even if it took you too long to try. The funeral was small. Some men from his old unit came older now, walking with canes or standing with effort, but coming anyway because that's what soldiers do. They told me stories I hadn't heard, memories polished smooth by years of retelling. And some I had heard before but in versions edited by time and kindness. I delivered the eulogy without wearing my uniform, without invoking rank. Just as a citizen. As a daughter. As someone who'd been shaped by his weather for better and worse in ways both harmful and strengthening. He was a difficult man, I said to the small gathering. He set standards so high they cast shadows over everything. He measured everyone against rules he never fully explained. He withheld approval like it was a strategic resource, that would lose value if given freely. I paused, looking out at faces that understood, that had known their own versions of this complicated man. But in the end, I continued, he was learning. Learning that strength can be gentle. That walls can become bridges, that it's never too late to offer a salute to someone you should have saluted decades ago. At the graveside, I placed the laminated wedding photo under the flag for a moment, that image of uniforms standing, of respect offered when cruelty was given, of chosen family protecting one of their own. Then I tucked it back into my jacket pocket. Some truths are public record. Some you carry quietly, privately, in places where only you know their full weight. On the drive home, the Blue Ridge Mountains blazed with autumn-color maples and oaks, setting the ridgeline on fire with red and gold and orange. That spectacular death that comes before winter's sleep. Grant kept one hand on the steering wheel, one on my knee steady, present, asking nothing, offering everything. "How's the aftertaste?" he asked after miles of companionable silence. "Clean," I said, surprised by the accuracy of the word, by how precisely it captured what I felt. Not sweet, not bitter, just clean, like something that needed to happen has finally happened. And now there's space for what comes next. Back at Langley, I rewrote part of the leadership course curriculum. We added a new unit called Respect Readiness, Practical Instruction in Listening Without Defensiveness, in apologizing without performing, in building teams where the newest recruit can tell the most senior officer hard truths and be heard rather than punished. I opened the first session of the new unit with a photograph, not the famous wedding salute that had done its work in the world. Instead, I showed them a picture from the rehab garden. 2 paper coffee cups sitting on a wooden bench, both labeled in black Sharpie marker, one reading Colonel, black, the other Marlowe, black. "This," I told the room full of young officers, "is what reconciliation often looks like in real life. Not a parade, not trumpets or headlines or viral moments, just a bench, just coffee, just 2 people who've hurt each other trying finally to see each other clearly." I let them look at that ordinary image, those 2 cups that cost maybe $3 total but represented years of work, of pain, of slow movement toward understanding. "Show up," I said. "Sit down. Salute what's true even when it costs you. Even when it means admitting you were wrong. Even when it would be easier to walk away. Especially then. I keep the wedding photo in my study now, propped on the bookshelf facing the window rather than the door. When afternoon light hits it just right, the salutes look almost liquid, almost in motion frozen but somehow still happening, still reverberating forward into every moment that follows. I don't need the reminder of the insult anymore. That part has lost its power. I keep the photo for what came after, for the answer that rose up to meet cruelty, for the wall of respect that formed spontaneously, because people who knew the truth refused to let lies stand unchallenged. If you've listened this far, if you've stayed with this story through all its complicated turns, you already know what I learned too late and just in time. Blood doesn't always salute. Biology doesn't guarantee love or respect or recognition. Sometimes the family you're born into can't see you, won't see you, will spend decades looking right through you towards something else, something that matters more to them than your actual presence. But honor can salute, character can, integrity can. You can build a life that stands on its own legs, that doesn't need permission or approval from people who've proven they won't give it freely. And if you're lucky, if you're patient enough and strong enough and brave enough to keep standing even when standing is lonely, sometimes the people who couldn't stand for you will find their feet. They'll rise awkward and late and imperfect, and they'll try. When they do, meet them with posture, not poison. Meet them with boundaries, but also with the possibility of something new being built from old wreckage. It won't erase what happened. It won't make the past hurt less. But it will prove something more important than vindication. It will prove what you've become despite everything, what you've built from nothing, who you chose to be when you could have chosen bitterness instead. If someone in your life taught you the wrong kind of hardness, you can teach them a different kind of strength. Not by preaching or lecturing, but by example. By living a life so full of integrity and genuine strength that eventually maybe they'll see the difference between what they taught and what you became. If you're the one who stayed seated when you should have stood, this is your invitation. Stand now. It's not too late. Use whatever hand still works, whatever voice you still have, whatever strength remains. We salute with what we have, not with what we wish we had. If this story settled somewhere in your chest, if it touched something you've been carrying quietly for years, take a moment tonight. Call the person you've been avoiding, or write the letter you can't quite send. Or forgive yourself for the family you didn't get, for the approval you couldn't earn no matter how hard you tried. Share this with someone who might need courage that sounds like quiet persistence. Someone who needs to know that bridges can be built from wreckage, that it's never too late for people to see each other truly, that salutes can be learned even by hands that forgot how to offer respect. And if you want more stories about the hard, honest truths that actually help people heal and grow stories about the messy, complicated work of being human and trying to do better than stay, stick around. Bring a spare coffee for the next conversation. Because this work, this building of understanding and mercy and earned respect, this work never really ends. It just gets quieter, deeper, more true. One conversation at a time, one small choice at a time, one imperfect salute at a time.